Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Mexico Hermanos Rodriguez post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this race? Did it have enough action for you? I mean, I saw lots of action in the midfield, but of course the very front runner wasn't very engaged. He kind of ran away with the field. And that second position didn't come into play until near the end. So what did you think about that? Did that give you enough excitement to carry forward, or did it be on your edge of your seat, or were you kind of bored with this race because Lando was just kind of running away with it? Or did you like that in the sense that it was, closing up that drivers' championship battle for future races? And so you're trying to figure out who will end up on top in the next 4 races. What about Oscar? Did he give you any information or an excitement for him trying to come back through the field, or were you kind of bored because he was not making his way through the field as fast as you would have liked? And Behrman getting up there and fighting with all the big wigs and on the front runners. Did that really keep you going? I thought it kept me going pretty good. I even wore my Haas shirt for this because I was really excited that he came up and got his top performing view. I was hoping he would get on the podium, but he couldn't quite keep that car that fast to make it up to that 3rd position. But for me, it was kind of exciting for him to be up there and trying to fight with all the bigwigs, especially at the very beginning when he kind of got alongside Max and put a little battle with Max on that. And then he kind of got out there and trying to deal with, the Mercedes and trying to figure out if they can overtake him or not. So that gave me a lot of insight there and a lot of fun to watch this race. And of course, we had all the bigwigs with Max and with Charles Leclerc at the very end, where Max was gaining ground quite significantly, and you were wondering if he's going to be able to pass Charles Leclerc and put that little bit extra gap between him and Oscar in that drivers' championship, narrowing that gap. And then what about Lewis and his penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage, where Leclerc and Max at the very beginning kind of ran off and kind of came back on without any penalty whatsoever? Did that bug you? Were you kind of interested in that aspect of this race, or was that just a side note that just kind of ended up making Lewis not a contention person in this race? How did that play out in your mindset on viewing this race? I would like to know. Like normal, I'll go from the back of the pack and work my way to the front of the pack, going through each driver, telling you what I think happened to them, if I know what happened to them, and how well they did, and how well I think they should have done or would have done, in this situation. So we'll start off with Liam Lawson, who started off in 15th and ended up in 20th with a DNF. He did gain 1 spot at the very first lap, so he did a decent start there. But then, had to pull it into the pits and stop on lap 6. He ended up causing front wing damage that made him come back on lap 2 for that pit stop, and then had a little bit too much damage, so he came back in, a couple laps later and just retired that car. Nico Hulkenberg started off in 13th and ended up in 19th. He also had a DNF. He didn't have a fairly poor start, losing 4 spots at the very first lap. And he did a 1-stop strategy, stopping on lap 26, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums. And then you could see him with that in-car camera, dash cam, where they were trying to mess with that steering wheel, trying to reboot it, trying to figure out what was going on, and ended up having to retire that car because of power unit issues. This gets us to Fernando Alonso, who started off in 14th and ended up in 18th with another DNF. It's apparently his 3rd or 4th DNF in Mexico, so he's not having a very good stretch in Mexico lately. He did lose 2 spots at the very first lap, so not the greatest start for him. He did stop on lap 20 and had a 7.1 second pit stop, which was pretty bad for him. And then he ended up having to retire the car on lap 35 because of brake failure issues. This gets us to Carlos Sainz, which had some connotations for the end of the race, where we see he started off in 12th and ended up in 17th with a DNF. He had a 5-place grid penalty for causing a collision with Kimi in the Coda GP, so he started off a little bit farther down than where he qualified from. He did a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 17, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs, and then taking that set of softs to lap 46, where he switched to another set of softs. He did get a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane, and then he had a drive-through penalty for speeding in the pit lane again. And if you look at what was causing this issue, it's because he retired on lap 70 when he pulled off on turn 16, causing that virtual safety car, which kind of caused a little bit of issues at the end for a lot of people where they going to see if Max was going to be able to pass Charles Leclerc, or, if Behrman was going to get past, in that running with Oscar as well. So there's a couple of issues there on the whole Drivers' Championship motto, but he pulled off pretty far, but then they ended up having to pull that virtual safety car because I guess it wasn't pulled in quite enough, and so they're trying to push that car a little bit farther in. Now, the reason he stopped is early on he had some front left wheel damage that caused some sensors to be damaged in that process, and that was causing him the pit limiter on his car to mess up, and that slipping in that instance, so I get him the 2 penalties, and it kind of caused some other issues that made him just end up finally just pulling off to the side of the track, and he was hoping not to cause any kind of safety cars or anything during that time, but it ended up doing that virtual safety car for just long enough to cause some issues. This gets us to Franco Colapinto, who started off in 20th and ended up in 16th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 48, switching from a set of hards to a set of softs. So he tried to go long on that set of hards and switch to a set of softs, but that didn't quite work out for him, and he ended up in the back of the pack. Pierre Gasly wasn't having a very good day either. He started off in 18th and worked his way up to 15th, but really couldn't get past that point. He did gain 3 spots at the very first lap, so he did a good start, gained some positions, but then kind of stalled out after that and in that running. He did pass Hulkenberg for 15th on lap 3, and I did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 33, switched that set of mediums to a set of softs. This gets us to Lance Stroll, who started off in 19th and ended up in 14th. He had a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 26, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums, and then taking that set of mediums to lap 43, where he switched to another set of softs. He did pass Hulkenberg for 17th on lap 3, passed Gasly for 16th on lap 6, passed Gasly again on lap 7 for 17th, passed Albon for 15th on lap 8, passed Alonso for 13th on lap 20, passed Franco for 17th on lap 28, passed Gasly again for 16th on lap 29, and passed Albon for 11th on lap 38. So he had a decent amount of action in there, so doing fairly good, getting him, those 5 places up, but not quite where he needs to be on the Aston Martin to get into the points again. So they'll have to work on that maybe in Brazil to see if they can get some extra, oomph in that Aston Martin to get them up there closer to the points. Isaac Hadjar didn't have a very good day, starting off in 8th and dropping down to 13th. He lost 3 positions in the very first lap, so a very poor start for him again. He did a one-stop strategy, going to lap 34 on a set of mediums before switching to a set of softs. And then otherwise, he was kind of a dull day. I know he's getting passed here and there, but couldn't really gain any ground during this race. So not a very good race for him. Alexander Albon started off in 17th and ended up in 12th. I know he was complaining about the balance of his car, not understanding it, and wanting to get checked in with Carlos Sainz and see how things were going with him in that car stint. I know they started off on that hard set for Alexander Albon, and that was probably giving some issues there because it didn't really want to come in quite really at all. And then when he was switching over to that softs, it didn't quite go to the way he wanted it either. Anyway, he started off in 17th, ended up in 12th, like I said. He did lose 1 spot at the very first lap, so not the best start for him. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 41, switching from a set of hards to a set of softs. He did pass Hulkenberg for 16th on lap 3, passed Gasly for 15th on lap 5, passed Ocon for 12th on lap 35, passed Franco for 15th on lap 44, and passed Isaac Hadjar for 12th on lap 65. So a decent number of passes again for him in this running. So, but not quite the where he was liking that Williams car. I know it seemed like Carlos was doing better, even though he had a kind of a damaged car in that front and may have gotten a little bit pushed up there closer to the points if it wasn't for that damage. So I don't know where Albon's car was in that running, and he wasn't really liking this day at all in that regard. You can tell on the radio he's getting frustration with all that going on in the balance of his car and trying to figure out what he needed to do. Yuki Tsunoda started off in 10th and ended up in 11th. He gained 2 spots at the very first lap, so a pretty good start for him, but ended up losing those spots overall and dropping down to that 11th marker. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 36, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. He did pass Ocon for 8th on lap 8, and passed Isaac Hydjar for 11th on lap 64. Otherwise, he was kind of in that middle zone, not really getting the action that he was looking for, and dropping back a little bit because of that weird strategy that he was on. That was trying to go a little bit longer on those set of mediums before switching to a set of softs, then having to take that softs a little bit longer distance in that run. This gets us to our top 10, where we find Gabriel Borletto, who made it into that last position for that last and only point, making it a little bit good effort for him in that Kick Sauber, F1 car. He was doing a fairly decent job, I think, overall. He started off in 16th, not quite where he up there wanted to be in that qualifying session, but ended up there in that 10th position, again, gaining that last point. He gained 3 spots at the very first lap, so he had a pretty good start there, gained some positions, and then he was able to pass Sainz for 12th on lap 9, passed Kimi for 8th on lap 26, and passed Hydjar for 10th on lap 62. So keeping it up there in the running, had a little bit of action, but not a lot of action, but make sure he was in that right position and gaining that last point, which is always good to see, especially in that Kick Sauber car, where they're not quite up there with the rest of the folks. So pretty good job for him, I think, and definitely better than his teammate who was struggling overall this weekend, where he didn't quite want to be. I know he was looking forward to be a little bit better off of that, but his teammates getting up there and starting to put some pressure on him. So we'll have to see how that dynamic pair continue the last 4 races. We see Esteban Ocon, who started off in 11th and ended up in 9th, gaining a couple points for Haas as well, so that's good to see. He gained 1 spot at the very first lap, so decent start for him, and he passed Alexander Albon for 12th on lap 35. But he was getting up there in that running, with that strategy, kind of pushing forward, with everybody else pitting, doing that one stop, where a lot of that group was doing a 2-stop strategy, so that kind of put some little effort and pressure on him to maintain those positions. And he did a fairly good job, and he almost was able to hold up Oscar, in that running, but not quite enough to really do what he wanted to do, even though, Behrman came out on top. It was just a little bit more pressure on, Behrman in that running. So, but it's still a good job for Ocon to play the team game and do that running, gain some positions, and get some points as well. So a decent job for him. Lewis Hamilton started off in 3rd and ended up in 8th. He did a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 23, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums, and that was a nice 13.5 second pit stop because of that 10-second penalty that he got for leaving the track and gaining an advantage when he was fighting with Max. And his second pit stop was taking those mediums to lap 47 before switching to another set of softs, and that was a nice good 3.5 second pit stop. He did pass Borletto for 10th on lap 30, passed Isaac Hydjar for 9th on lap 31, passed Yuki for 8th on lap 35, passed Ocon for 8th on lap 50, and then at the very end, he actually had a 3 track limit warning. So if he had 1 more track limit, he would have gotten another penalty for that. But he was able to maintain just the right amount to gain a little extra advantage. So it's kind of sad to see that Lewis get that 10-second penalty and drop him out of the contention of essentially getting closer or onto that podium position for Ferrari in that running. I know I was really looking forward to trying to get his first podium for Ferrari in that scenario, and he was looking fairly good at the very beginning, but that cost him at the very beginning by kind of cutting that corner and not really giving those positions back instead. So he got that 10-second penalty, which kind of shoved him back into the field, which then he had to kind of fight for any and all positions. So it was a good job for that. So I have to say a mediocre job for Lewis Hamilton just because of that penalty and not really playing into that, giving that back up and potentially having a better fight near the race instead of, losing those 10 seconds that threw him back into the midfield section. George Russell started off in 4th and ended up in 7th. He lost 1 position at the very start of the race, so not the greatest start for him. He did a 2-stop strategy as well, stopping on lap 25, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums. And that pit stop was about 2.7 seconds, so a decent pit stop for that. And then he went to lap 48 on those set of mediums before switching back to a set of softs, where it was a 3.2 second pit stop. So not the greatest second pit stop, but not a bad pit stop to say the least. He did pass Borletto for 8th on lap 28, passed Heizar for 7th on lap 29, passed Yuki for 6th on lap 30, and passed or swapped positions with Kimi for 4th on lap 41 after he had that tussle trying to get past, and Kimi wasn't able to get past him, but we ended up getting that swap position because he said he was faster, but then Oscar was coming up behind him, and so he was kind of heating up those brakes, and so they finally let them swap, which I kind of agree with. I think they should have done it earlier to actually give him a little bit more chance to actually overtake Behrman and potentially get up there on the podium position. But instead, they kind of left him back there a little bit too long. If that would have happened, I don't know if it would have played out for him. But because of that, he kind of made the agreement that if he wasn't able to get that, he was going to swap back, and that's what he ended up swapping back into that 7th position overall. And this gets us to his teammate, Kimi Antonelli, who started off in 6th and ended up in 6th. He also lost his position on the very first lap, so not the greatest start for him. So I'm not sure if it was something with those Mercedes or if there was something else going on and they just didn't have a good start. He did a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 22, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums, and then taking that set of mediums to a lap 47, where he switched to a second set of softs. And that second pit stop was a 4.6 second pit stop, so a little bit slower pit stop on the Mercedes count, but trying to get into those positions so all those seconds matter. And he passed Russell for 6th on lap 6, passed Stroll for 10th on lap 25, passed Borletto for 8th on lap 26, passed Heizar for 6th on lap 27, passed Yuki for 5th on lap 33, passed Ocon for 7th on lap 49, and then he swapped positions with his teammate Russell for 6th on lap 62. So we come to our top 5, where we find Oscar Piastri, who's able to work his way back up into that 5th position, keeping that gap down for him on that Drivers' Championship, so he didn't lose quite as many points as we thought that he might be losing at the very beginning of this race, where he started off in 7th and then ended up in that 5th position. He also lost 2 positions in the very first lap, so that kind of put him in behind to start off with, so not a good start for him. He did a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 24, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums, and that was a 3.6 second pit stop, so a little bit slower on their front. And then he carried that set of mediums to lap 47, where he switched to another set of softs. And I couldn't get that number, even though they were showing the full pit stop length. They didn't ever actually show the actual pit stop time. So I was never able to figure out what that second pit stop was when he came in alongside of Kimi, and was kind of working out those positions. So if you know that, it'd be kind of interesting to see how that played out in this run. He did pass Yuki for 8th on lap 8. Then he had to pass Yuki again for 8th on lap 11. He passed Borletto for 9th on lap 29. Passed Isaac Heizar for 8th on lap 30. Passed Yuki for 7th on lap 34. Passed Ocon for 6th on lap 49. And then passed Russell near the end for 5th on lap 60. And he was coming up on Behrman, as I said, trying to get past Behrman, except for that virtual safety car came out. Now, Behrman claims that he was going to be able to keep the distance behind him because he had saved up a bunch of battery life to be able to be deployed to keep Oscar behind. But you never know what that differences are for those McLarens and that Haas, and how that would have played out if that virtual safety car hadn't kind of interfered with that. So that would have been interesting to see. And of course, it would have kept him in the Drivers' Championship lead if he was able to do that as well. So that is kind of a shame for Oscar, but otherwise he was doing a really good job, even though he qualified kind of poorly and kind of got off to a slow start. He was able to get back up there and kind of minimize the damage to most of the degree. Now, that does make it a lot more interesting for the next 4 races and how that's going to play out in this run. So we'll have to see how that kind of goes through. Oliver Redmond, as I said, did a really excellent job, I think. Started off in 9th and ended up in 4th. He gained 3 spots at the very first lap, so a really good start for him, getting back up there in the front runners. He did a 2-stop strategy, trying to keep Kimi and them, from undercutting him or overcutting him, getting those around those tire positions. So he's kind of covering those positions. I think that's probably the wise thing to do. I don't think his tires would have lasted the full length, and he probably would have fallen into the clutches if he tried to do that one stop at that point. As I said, he did a two-stop strategy, stopping on lap 24, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums, and that was a fairly decent stop with 2.7 seconds. And then he carried that medium set to lap 48, where he switched to another set of softs, and that was a 2.3 second pit stop. So it was a really good pit stop for him. He did kind of pass Max Verstappen for fourth on lap 6 when Max went off the track a little bit, fighting Lewis, and they were kind of getting back on the track, kind of moving that position and the momentum around a little bit, and he found that gap and was able to get up into that fourth position. So that was really cool to see him go up there fighting with the world champion Max Verstappen and how that was going to play out. He did pass Borletto for 7th on lap 26. He passed Highjar for 5th on lap 28. He passed Yuki for 4th on lap 32. And he was driver of the day for all the intrinsic purposes for the votes. And I totally agree with that. I think he deserved it. Getting up there as a kind of a rookie, getting up there in a Haas, getting him to that fourth position, getting close to that podium position. It was too bad that he didn't really get that podium position, but well-deserved driver of the day. Now, honorable mentions, of course, you have them, but Lando Norris, who ran away with it completely, got pole position, he had the good start, maintained it, pulled out the really huge gaps in this race. You could also give it to Charles Leclerc, being able to maintain that and hold off Max Verstappen, even with that virtual safety car in their mix, but holding off to get that second position. And you could give it to Max Verstappen, who's kind of far back and trying to get up there and put pressure, and almost got that second position as well. So those are kind of the honorable mentions, but who would you give it to, or honorable mentions to, for that drivers of the day? Then we come to Max Verstappen, who started off in 5th and ended up in 3rd. He did gain one spot at the very first lap, even though it was kind of a crazy mess, him going 4 wide in that first corner and having to cut that corner through, almost wrecking into the wall during that process. And I was like, how did he even just keep that one position that he gained and not lose a bunch more in that running? But he was able to do that and keep that going. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 37, where he switched from that medium set that he started off on to a set of softs, where it came in a lot better for him. And he liked that soft set much better, and he started really making ground on that soft set of tires. He did pass Hamilton for 3rd on lap 6, where I said that battle. Then he passed Hamilton again for 7th on lap 47. I think Max, as I said, did an excellent job in this. He kind of got pushed out wide on that very first corner, but was able to maintain it, not really fall into the wreck into the wall or damage his car too much, and going over the grass and getting back on. And then he had a little other fight with Hamilton a little bit later, banging some tires, kind of going off again there. So maintaining that car in all that run and still making it up there and putting all that pressure on those around him was a really good job for Max. You can never count Max out. Charles Leclerc started off in 2nd and ended up in 2nd. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 31, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums. And he had a nice quick pit stop with a 2.2 second pit stop. Other than that, he was just kind of maintaining that position for most of this race until the end, where then he had to put a strong defense for him when Max was, gaining ground on him quite handedly, whereas tires were running low, and Max's tires were kind of coming back into that realm of those soft tires. So you had that dynamic there going on, keeping the race on the edge on who was going to come out second, and potentially changing some of the drivers' championship numbers a little bit more, and seeing if, gaining that extra ground that Max really needs to win this drivers' championship this year after coming back from this huge deficit that he was already in. So, but Charles Leclerc did a fairly good job. I know they weren't quite where the McLarens were. So for him to, keep it clean, keep it going, and keep it in that realm was a really good job for me, in my view. And then, of course, we come to Lando Norris, who started off in 1st, ended up in 1st. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 34, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums, and that was a decent pit stop with a 2.6 second pit stop. And he had a good start, kept the lead of the race through, turn 1 and turn 2, which is really what he needed. And then he started just pulling up a gap from there on. And he was able to make his pit stop without too much effort, having that big gap, not really having any pressure on him. For losing that first position, they would even have to regain that. So he kind of maintained that lead throughout this full race, putting huge numbers on this. So excellent job for him in this run, and well-deserved. And now he is in the lead by one single point. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the next few races in that battle to see who wins each race to determine who's going to be on top of the Drivers' Championship. And of course, with Max there, who knows what that'll play out in that between the McLaren drivers. So good job for Lando. Excellent job, actually, for Lando. Good job for Charles and Max as well. And of course, we had the rookie Oliver Behrman in that mix, going up there, throwing some excitement in there as well. So a really good job, really good race. I'd probably give it a 9 out of 10. It was almost a perfect race in that regard. That virtual safety car at the end kind of dampened things a little bit for me, where we didn't really get to see the battles for those final positions on those final laps. But other than that, excellent race in my view. So to give you a rundown of how things went during this race, we can see by lap 5, it was a 1.92 second lead for Lando over Charles Leclerc. By lap 10, it was a 3.01 second lead for Lando over Charles Leclerc. By lap 15, it was a 5.3 second lead for Lando over Charles Leclerc. So, you can see that Lando is making that good gap at the very beginning of the race, and that kind of ballooned as we went through this race. So by lap 25, it was a 11.57 second lead for Lando over Charles Leclerc. And then Charles Leclerc pitted, and so by lap 35, we had a 26.2 second lead for Lando over Max. And then Lando pitted and came back out. So by lap 50, it was down to a 22.7 second lead for Lando over Charles Leclerc. By lap 60, it was a 28.1 second lead for Lando over Charles Leclerc. By lap 65, it was about the same with the 28.23 second lead for Lando over Charles Leclerc. And at the end of the race, it was over 30 seconds with a 30.32 second lead for Lando over Charles Leclerc. And of course, we had that virtual safety car right in the middle of that 70th lap. It went to 71. So we finished under green, but it was really not really where most people could pass in that regard, especially with Max and potentially with Oscar and Oliver Behrman in that mix. So that kind of limited that view, kind of shrunk that gap, and we'll see that a little bit. So I have 3 graphs here for you. This is the one right before Charles Leclerc decided to pit, so about 32-ish lap. And you can see that gap, like 18.175 between Norris and Charles Leclerc. And then he dropped back behind Max Verstappen at this point. And you can kind of see that gap in where they are relative to each other. And of course, the rest of the field getting close to Charles Leclerc in that run after he came back out of the pits. So he had to put a little bit of pressure in there, but he was able to maintain that gap in that pit window. And then we come to the middle of the track time period right after those top three had pitted. And so this is like right after Max pitted. And so you can see that big gap there. So you can see, Lando Norris here on lap 35-ish pitted, got closer to Max in that running, but then Max still had to pit. So about lap 38-ish, you can see Max pitting, dropping back behind a bunch of the field here, where Charles Leclerc was gaining some ground on him in that run. But then you can see all that gap, and so you can see, in that 17-second lead for Lando over Charles Leclerc at this point. And of course, this is right after Max pitted in that run. And so you have the same 3 that have already pitted at this point in time. And of course, by the end, this is a little bit graph right before the virtual safety car came out. And the gap here is kind of showing that, close, and see how far, Lando was ahead, with that 30.79 second, gap between him and Charles Leclerc. But Charles Leclerc was getting close to getting passed by Max Verstappen in this, and you can see how close that was in that graph and how well those were coming together over the laps. So you can see that Max had a really good chance of passing Charles Leclerc on that last lap and gaining that second position if it wasn't for that virtual safety car. And you can see that virtual safety car kind of come out in where those nice big U-dips in that timing run go through. And of course, you have a few others down there with Oliver Behrman and Oscar a little bit farther down. And then, of course, the Mercedes in that aqua color a little bit there to give you a little bit more idea of those top runners in this field. So what did this do to our driver standings? Of course, we have Lando taking the lead by a single point, now with 357 points over Oscar's 356 points. So he dropped down to second place for Oscar. And we have Max Verstappen with 321, so not too far behind. George Russell with 258, Charles Leclerc with 210, and Lewis Hamilton with 146. So you can kind of see those top five and the gaps between them. But what's changed here, of course, is Lando jumping over Oscar. And of course, we see a nice big jump for Oliver Behrman, jumping up to 13th, jumping over Pierre Gasly, Yuki Tsunoda, Esteban Ocon, Liam Lawson, and Lance Stroll in that running. Now with 32 points for Oliver Behrman, tied with Lance Stroll. So we'll have to see if Lance Stroll or Oliver Behrman can edge out that extra point and really solidify that 13th marker in these last few races. And for the constructor standings, of course, we already know McLaren won the constructor standing in Singapore, but we have a couple of changes here. We have Ferrari, bumping up over Mercedes into that second position now with 356 points over 355 points for Mercedes. And we have Haas jumping up to that 8th position over Kick Sauber Ferrari with that 62 points over Kick's 60 points. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the next few races to see if any kind of edge can be given on any of those constructors in that running. Or if Red Bull is going to be able to overtake Mercedes and Ferrari as well, they still have a good chance of doing that. And of course, what do we have coming up next? We have Brazil, or Jose Carlos Place in my American tongue. If it's pronounced any different, you can list that in the comments. I don't know how to speak Brazilian, so I'm probably butchering that name quite a bit. But anyway, that is in a couple of weeks, in November 8th. It is actually a sprint weekend, so we're going to have a sprint race on Saturday before the main GP race on Sunday. It has a length of 4.309 miles, and the sprint will have 24 laps being run for a total race distance of 103.46 miles. The current lap record holder is Valtteri Bottas in 2018 with 1 minute 10.54 seconds, and it was first introduced in 1973. Now, if you get lucky and I get off my butt, I may have an extra video out the next weekend, kind of going over some of the, pit walk and some other things that I had at COTA, a couple of weeks ago. So hopefully I'll get that out and give you some extra, footage and some new videos to, look at before the Brazilian GP race. But until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell. Let's kick Sauber start.